Yeah. Our next speaker is Walter Lorenz, one of our honorary doctors. Walter Lorenz was professor of social work at University College Cork in Ireland and at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy, where he served also 2 4-year terms as rector. He is currently contract professor at Charles University, Prague. Professor Lorenz practiced the social work profession for 8 years in East London during the 70s before starting an academic career. With a special research interest in international comparative issues of social work training at the university level, he was also active after 1989 in collaboration with universities in Central and Eastern Europe, where social work education had to be restarted after communism. For 10 years, he was president of the European Center for Community Education, a network of lecturers from all European countries, including colleagues from Mittuniversitetet in Östersund. His further research interest in publications cover anti-racism and current, as well as European and social policy. Please, Professor Lorenz, very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes? Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction and indeed for the invitation. I feel very honored and particularly honored as a member of a discipline that is still a relative newcomer to the academic world, to the academic Olympus. So this is a recognition for our discipline, and I would like to talk about the character and the purpose of our discipline and our profession of social work. In our discipline of social work, our central professional task is helping people with their social problems. You might ask, doesn't everybody do that? Is that not a skill that is natural to all of us? Well, first of all, in complex modern societies, social relationships have become complex enough so that in critical situations, professionals are mandated to do the helping according to particular standards. So I want to show briefly the complexity that is actually involved in a simple act of helping. So imagine a person who, on account of an accident or a disability, is unable to feed herself. She needs an assistant who sits, or does she stand next to her? So you notice my hesitation in even answering that kind of a question. Let's call her Jane. Jane here is, while she's being fed, equipped with a napkin that goes right round her neck, and that already makes us pause for a moment. Does everybody's napkin go round their neck, or do we normally sit down with a napkin that just covers our knees? Is that not something childlike about having a napkin round your neck? What does that do to the person's dignity to be treated like that? Now you might say, of course, it's simply a practical thing because her nice blouse needs to be protected, and therefore there is good reason to put the napkin round her neck. But there is a question of dignity and there's a question of ethics to be answered in that simple act of putting a napkin on a person. Let us play the fictitious assistants to Jane and begin the feeding process. Now the dinner is a simple meal of, here in Sweden, meatballs and perhaps mashed potatoes and peas. But before we scoop up the first spoon and feed her, a portion of peas perhaps, we again hesitate. Does Jane really want to start with peas? Or does she want to start with a meatball? Do we need to ask her what she wants? But when we ask her, does that not make the relationship very complicated? If we ask before every spoonful, what do you want to have now? Now, of course, if we had a longer standing relationship with her, we would know her preferences. But in order to form a relationship with her, we need to ask questions. We need to interact with her. And the kind of interaction that we have with her can decide whether we really understand her, not just because of her possible language limitations. The way we conduct a conversation, and particularly the way we conduct a conversation as a stranger, as a newcomer, as a professional, determines the nature of that relationship. And then there is something about the speed with which we feed her and the time she can take to chew every mouthful. Can she determine the pace? Or do we, inadvertently perhaps, give the impression that she needs to eat a little bit faster? Because we might have to feed another person as well. So we have an organization around us who, in a way, determines our timetable and determines the time we can actually allocate to a particular person as we feed her. Does she eat enough? Do we, by dictating the pace, perhaps limit her food intake, and we have to balance out that she might be encouraged, need to be encouraged to eat a bit more because we have a responsibility for keeping up her nutritional level. All this involves intricate relationships and involves processes that happen both at the level of the psychology, but, as I've said, involve questions of ethics and involve questions even of human rights. Has she got the right to determine, I have enough now and I don't want to eat any more? Now, again, we are conducting this relationship as professionals. And of course, feeding other people might happen in other contexts as well. And in that context, feeding might be something that is fun, that actually has a ritual and that is being shared amongst friends. But are we friends in a helping relationship with somebody who's not part of our friendship circle, our family? These friends, relatives might normally know what is appropriate in a particular situation. We have to construct what is appropriate in a particular situation. And therefore, the central aspect of our subject matter of social work is the shaping of social space. And social space is always defined by a balance between distance and closeness. How much distance do we as a stranger have to that person, and how much do we invade perhaps her private space, her intimacy? This social space is something that is quite invisible normally, but the social space also exists when we are in a way far from other people. And I would claim even a situation like that person chooses to distance himself from other people, and we all have time and occasion to distance ourselves, has a social implication and makes a social gesture, therefore. So it is this social space that is, in all its complexity, of distance and closeness, the core subject of the discipline of social work. Now, of course, we do not normally teach our students how to feed another person. We would assume that the sensitivity that is required for that is something that the students already bring with them, and we only add, if you like, the theoretical reflections on all the implications of that in our academic studies. Students indeed, and we require that, bring with them a rich and hopefully also quite differentiated range of life experiences. But the purpose of academic training is to analyze, reflect on these experiences, and then to integrate the complexity that lies behind this seemingly self-evident social space into something that then becomes a professional way of acting. Negotiating this social space professionally is therefore not just a matter of psychological competence. We act always in the context of organizations, and organizations have rules and have objectives, and these objectives might be humanitarian, but these objectives might also be commercial. Caring for people in crisis costs, but is there a price tag on something like dignity and rights? And particularly in our times, is caring something that a society can still afford? Is the recognition of human rights, the right to self-determine your private life, is that part of an agency's, of an organization's agenda? Is it part of our national agenda when it seeks to ensure the quality and efficiency of organizations? Is it something that depends on our nationality? And one of the previous speakers has talked about the growth of nationalism as a reference point for people's belonging or not belonging in our European societies. So this is what we teach to question the appropriate, sensitive and humane feeding of Jane requires therefore not just mechanical skills, psychological empathy, communicative skills to do justice to her personhood. It also requires sophisticated organizational, economic, legal, and indeed political knowledge and competence, and all that in combination. To speak about the actuality of social space, we all had lately vivid encounters with the complexity of that social space, and this on a global dimension. When in the COVID pandemic, we were all required to do social distancing. And I know Sweden went there originally its own separate way, but we ended all up in being subjected to social distancing. Why was it not called spatial distancing and social distancing? Presumably because the ruling was not just about geometrical measurements, about our health and how it could be protected, but the social implications of that space. Through these restrictions, the social attributes of space, or private space, became a public issue. The social significance of space extended from the prohibition to shake hands, let alone embrace each other when we greet each other, to the prohibition of entering public spaces. And those people who were made and continued to traverse public spaces were celebrated as heroes when they were acting as nurses or couriers or pizza delivery people, at least for the time of the pandemic. But during the pandemic, I think we all became more aware of the significance of social space and of the significance of how difficult it is to balance distance and closeness. And our social fabric, I would claim, has already before the pandemic become very fragile and very, very uncertain about where the boundaries lie. And to some extent, the boundaries have become much more visible. Many communities are now gated communities that are surrounded by entry requirements, social distancing. Other communities have become no-go zones in the slum areas, and these are not just areas in other parts, but in Europe itself. Policing of ethnic boundaries has become evidently problematic in the movement of Black Lives Matter, for instance. And again, it was significant that that erupted during the pandemic. Border controls have become much more visible. We all have heard about the return to national and nationalistic politics. To sum it up, well cared for social spaces are valuable. They symbolize social belonging, and boundaries have to be maintained not just as an act of personal attitude towards it, but as we notice now, both in our private lives and in public lives, touch is a welcome relief on one hand, but it can also be an intrusion that needs to be publicly regulated and publicly discussed. So all these are questions of intense political virulence. These are the questions that social workers on academic courses learn to address fully, and their responsibility is not only to competently negotiate social space between them and the people in crisis, but to ensure also the structural, legal, economic, and indeed social conditions that make social spaces livable for everybody and not just for people in crisis. All these levels are involved in determining the balance between closeness and distance when we help Jane to eat the personal, the organizational, the cultural, the economic, the political level. Our attitudes at the micro level mirror and indeed influence the social relations and the political relations at the political level. As we are again trying to find ways in which we greet each other, we are dealing with political issues and not just with private issues. Peace and the dignity and social cohesion of our societies and our nations do not only get negotiated at the big political arenas, important though they might be. I think they're also being negotiated in the micro relations of professional helping, where dignity and the human right to self-determination are always at stake. And with that, my profession indeed, and my discipline of social work is dedicated to this task. And I must say, I'm proud to be a member of that profession. So thank you very much again for the invitation. Tack för uppmärksamhet.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Questions, please. Angelica.
Thank you very much for your speech and all the reflections that it causes about the involvement of the political, organizational, structural to the personal and private, and the infliction. I have two questions. One, you said organizational, economic, and legal and political competencies are crucial so that social workers can work accordingly to and responsible, so to speak. And of course, my question is with the development we can see in very many countries, maybe all countries, towards new public management, towards neoliberalization, that like the issues and structures of companies get into social welfare institutions. How can you see that this affects the framework of how we can work? And the second one, you are very much talking about physical environment as well, and that it has an impact and an importance for social values and social work. And of course, I'm thinking traditionally we have been talking about environment as the social environment within social work, but we of course heard about natural environment, a physical environment, and climate change has not yet been such a big issue for social work, but as a very important physical environment, do you think that it should have more space within the research and teaching of social work?
Okay, thank you very much. Two very central questions. The first question, the imposition of not just management, but of downright commercial interests in social service and indeed also in health organizations is really something that is quite central to the future of these professions and the way they're being conducted. And what I mean to say is that, yes, of course, social workers cannot claim that economic aspects of an organization do not matter. And that they can just make demands and there is an unlimited supply of resources. But the way resources are allocated, and for instance in my example the way time is allocated, should not be dictated by an impersonal time scheme that somebody in management has worked out on some statistical averages, but that precisely the work of a social worker or of a care worker should also be to influence the way these resources are being allocated in the interest of patients. We had a very drastic example of that, and I was involved in research in that during the lockdown. The way regulations about social isolation were administered in residential homes for elderly people often just meant that people were so afraid of going against those regulations that they isolated residents with enormous psychological costs, even health costs, that people died from loneliness. We have done a study together with doctors where, if you like, a balanced managing of the regulation in certain circumstances might have actually be more in the interest of the individual patient, without necessarily saying, you know, we can do without rules and we can just do everything from a case-to-case situation. So these are the balancing competences. And as far as the ecological example is concerned, I think we are entering a phase in which we all become aware that, for instance, poverty that is related to then the inability to heat yourself adequately, to feed your family adequately, is not just an economic issue, but behind that lies also an ecological issue. And the way that is being managed, again, requires a very differentiated attitude of not saying to people who live in poverty, well, you just have to learn how to economize with your limited resources a bit more, which is always the old moralizing attitude. You know, you have to learn how to save money and be wise the way you spend your money. But to turn also the attention in the other direction of, yes, people in poverty often have very clever resources and competences of managing limited resources, but that should not be used as a punishment against them, but should be used as a way of questioning the allocation of public resources that lie behind that, in recognition of the fact that, yes, our not just economic resources are not unlimited, but also our ecological resources are not unlimited.
More questions? Okay. I have one question of my own. As I understand, people forget the language they have learned as elderly people. Yeah. And based on your research, what do you think that kind of phenomena will raise as challenges in the future?
You mean have learned the not learned the language that they grew
Immigrants,
up in?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, as grow-ups,
Yes.
they forget the language when they get elderly. And my wife is very nervous about that. I know that.
Okay. I think that, I mean, language is one of the clearest markers of social belonging. And as a migrant myself, and as somebody who had to come to terms with several language contexts, I think one of the important aspects of opening yourself to another language is the recognition that the other language does not take away your original language, but widens out your social network, your opportunities, and instead of it being a barrier, instead of it being also a threat, it is something that helps you perhaps even to discover the value of your own language a bit more. So I think all integration projects that or operate with the premise, the sooner you forget your origins, your habits, your cultural and your linguistic background, and you become indistinguishable from the new environment in which you live. All these attempts only lead to a very militant reassertion of your original identity. And a lot of fundamentalism goes back to this misconception about doing away with one in order to be fully a member of the other. On the contrary, the other way operates towards a real intercultural understanding. Thank you very much, Saman. Thank you for your questions.